Hey there, sinners. It's Adam Nox, and welcome to another episode of The Cult of You, and I'm back. It's been a while since you and I had direct sessions, and I was sharing very specific ideas, and there's many reasons for that. I kind of figured that what was very important has been said. I created a mini masterclass. I released that out. It's free. You can find the playlist inside of this channel. And I thought those were most of the core concepts. And sure, I got some criticism for one or two of my ideas, but for the most of it, where the criticism came from didn't really carry any weight, especially not from the perspective of a serious occult practitioner who's actually proven or walked their talk instead of just, you know, armchair occultists with their deep philosophical ideas or assumptions lacking the experience. So for the most of it, you know, I was expecting that I would have some kind of criticism. After all, I'm not exactly putting out, you know, sweet cartoons for the family. The content here is very niche, very specific, and it's because of this that I also have the warning label that comes now at the start of the episode that just describes those essential ideas. However, at one point, one student or one seeker wrote a comment, and it was a comment for which I received criticism, and that actually made me take it seriously. This was on the video, The Psychology of Daemonology. At first, I assumed that these were assumed natural principles, but I realized that was my error. It was my mistake to think that everybody had that same upbringing and that same knowledge and that same assumption. In fact, that's one of the assumptions I myself try to fight so rigorously against, and hence why my own course on the cult.co.za is a 2-year program that goes through in detail all of these things. So even though I decided to not bring out hectic new teachings, I realized what was important after that is that I needed to provide context. I needed to provide answers to these fundamental, oftentimes missing foundational ideas of occult thought and our philosophy and our approaches, just simply so that the answer is out there for the sincere seeker to help resolve those psychological conflicts. It reminds me of when I was very young, sitting in a spiritualist center, and the spiritualist teacher, who was a very gifted psychic and medium, shared the notion that we are all God. And one lady in the circle found great offense to this concept. How can you say that you are God? How could you have such hubris? It was at that moment that I realized, as sincere as this lady's challenge was, she simply lacked the fundamental understanding of this occult perspective. And that was honestly one of my opening points when I started actually teaching and sharing ideas. I want to dive into this today. There's always a debate or a discussion about, is it psychological? Are the spirits within you? Are the spirits outside? You know, what is mumbo jumbo about the oneness versus all these things? There's a very fundamental misunderstanding of occult thought that is present in those types of questions. And it's one that I'd like to address today. There's a philosophy that says, you know, it is, you know, that spirituality is Kabbalistic and it's not accurate towards my view of demonology or my almost religious view of the spirits. Even though I can respect each of these individual views, it contradicts what we know today in quantum mechanics. It contradicts what we know today in psychology. There are so many aspects of human development that explore these things and give credence to it, which really is something that I feel is fundamental to being addressed. And I think it's important to being addressed because it's the key behind what helped me develop the immunology, so to speak, against demons or against negative forces in that assumption. And when I talk about that in that video, also a link to that reference inside of the masterclass is below. So without any further yantering, let's get into today's episode, and remember to live deliciously. Okay, so let's begin today's discussion with that story that I kind of opened up with. I was 17 years or younger probably at the time, 16 maybe even. But I found spiritualism after searching and questioning varied religions throughout the time. In fact, walking into the Spiritualist Center was the most beautiful experience for me in my pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. Because when I walked into varied Christian churches at the time, no offense to those that have the faith, but when I walked in, I was greeted with judgment and an ideal that I was supposed to live up to that I was not conscious of. And really flew in characteristics to me. And we all understand what that does to even a child's development, let alone somebody who is lost and confused and seeking something of deep spiritual meaning. But when I entered into the Spiritualist Center, I found this beautiful little church out in Krugersdorp. And as I walked in, my great spiritual, then became my great spiritual grandfather, Papa Sirio, and his wife, Baba, greeted me with open arms as if I was a lost sage seeking. I felt such love and such acceptance for the first time in my life that I jumped in to explore and discover what these people had that made them free of judgment. That not only made them free of judgment, but gave them the ability to see into my heart and soul and future. I remember sitting days at Papa Sirio's feet at the circle, listening to him predict accurately events that were going to unfold in our country and in the world in the next week and in the next process. And then we would sit and we'd send light and positive energy towards these, and we were engaged in actual service, helping the people of the Spiritualist Center, helped worked under hospice and worked with people, aiding them in the passage, helped with the families. This was a real place of service, and it really spoke to me, and it became one of the cornerstones of my philosophies and why I believe in spirituality the way it is. But you know, after I started my developmental process and devouring every book in the library that was available, I started teaching myself and doing clairvoyance and doing the mediumistic activity. And I was sitting in a circle with somebody who was training with me at the time, a friend of mine, Clinton. Clinton was the grandson of Sirio, and him and I both developed psychics and as clairvoyance in our young age, where we traveled around and did that John Edwards kind of thing. It was in this experience where I was sitting in circle with him where a well-meaning lady felt the urge to just challenge the idea. There was a common idea in spiritualism back in the time, which is, I am God. And the phrase and things that would go about it would be trust your God thought and stuff like this. This lady came obviously from a very staunch Christian background, but had come to spiritualism because of loss and needed to make peace with the idea of death and discovering it. And she had her first experience with a medium that got her in contact with her past loved one. So she was sold on the evidence, but she was struggling with these ideas. The shock in my friend's idea, and him and I always used to joke, and we said, I speak Hebrew and he speaks Hebrew. And it was simply a case of our approaches, our tacks. I was very analytical and he was far more experience orientated, which is also coincidentally one thing that made him such an incredible psychic and such an incredibly powerful medium and healer. I was very obsessed with the mental part, though. I wanted to understand these things because I also came from a back of strong indoctrination, and I had a lot of these psychological limitations or conditions that I had to overcome and not just discard, but actually resolve within myself before I could free myself enough to really embrace truth. So I opened up and I said to her, look, the thing that you need to understand here is that we're not saying that you as an individual or me as an individual is God. That is ludicrous. Each and every one of us can recognize very tangibly the problems and the issues that we have in life. Sometimes you pay your bills on time. Sometimes you don't. None of these are the marks of being God. What we're saying is that fundamentally, each and every one of us, what is the root of identity? What is the root of the self? What is the root of these things? If we stem and dig deep down enough in the root, which was the instrument that meditation allows us to do, eventually these layers start to dissolve themselves. They start to disappear, and we come to experience ourselves as the transcendent force of God. And that recognition, when the mystic or when the medium says, I am God, it's the same as when the Buddha says it or the enlightened one says it. It doesn't mean that the persona, this is not a discussion at the level of the persona. It's a discussion at an almost quantum fundamental level, that fundamentally each and everything, that the foundation of all being is God. That this concept, at least, that we understand as God, which, comes from the German and the, more Scandinavian Herrgott, is this foundational authority from which everything stems or is rooted. And as such, we are God. Each and every one of us is God. So is the plants, the animals. It's a perception of life at a fundamental level as sacred. But it also is a difference in terms of psychology. You see, instead of the adept or the practitioner looking at their experience or their concept of a self as a sinful, limited, or negative thing, and as such placing restrictions and oftentimes negative programs on its expression and thus the behavior that flows onto it, there is a perception of healing and growth and foundation. This also has a lot to do with your perception of God, by the way. If your perception of God is, as the evil Jehovah, as a lot of, occultists have, that wants as a war god and all this stuff, that's going to be problematic, because that's going to be the thing that you're manifesting and relating for. But hence the phrase that the faith of a mustard seed can move a mountain. When we begin to shift these fundamental views within our unconscious, within our core self, we shift our relationship. But this helped me to understand, as we helped her understand that experience, and aided her to kind of connect with her own psychic abilities, as she started seeing more potential within the self and the eternal self, that there were many other things that would come up between that and other groups. But I want to speak about a couple of these things very specifically. I want to put them into perspectives in a nice clean format that you have a frame of reference to understand them from when we as occultists refer to it. And this is important to me because when I was referring to the subject and the psychology of demonology, I was speaking to it, which for a layman, for somebody that is not an initiate, for somebody that's just out there in the unknown, like that lady, sincerely seeking answers and trying to deal with her own symbolism, that individual may think that when we, as individuals of the occult, say self, we're simply speaking about the ego or the persona. This is an incorrect and false understanding, and rightfully so, given the many interpretations that are out there from people when they look at psychological fields, especially when they're not formally trained inside of these fields and they've mostly just read the pop psychology and self-help books that are out there. But the fundamental perception of this is far grander, and that's what I'd like to lay out today. So let's start with that very quickly. When we look at this, and I'm going to be referencing a bunch of different things to help kind of give you metaphors or ideas to understand it better. In the biblical context, there's always this talk of the soul, which is the psyche. So the psyche is always trying to avoid hell, and it's always trying to come to heaven, right? And we give this perception that's put in the biblical context or in Western religions as, we're trying to get back into heaven and save ourselves from hell. The truth is that this is actually a fundamental principle, not of the spiritual universes, but of the actual brain and the body mechanism. You see, all human behavior is driven out of the need to avoid perceived pain and achieve perceived pleasure. Now, this is a very important principle because firstly, it reveals to us the mind control that's going on in religious systems and things like that when people are saying this path will lead to that and this path will lead to that without any evidence. It does become a self-fulfilling prophecy when accepted. But fundamentally, what is more at the root of this is this concept of what you associate pain and what you associate pleasure to, or heaven and hell to, creates your experience or your first manifestation of a sense of self, because you get to go, I like that, I don't like that, that's me, that's not me. You've heard that, you've heard people say that. It's this projection which creates this hallucination of what in old spiritualisms would be referred to as the false self, which we can see is the personality vehicle. It's mutable, it's a changeable thing, because the second we change that value hierarchy we shift it. It becomes something completely different. Now, its entire construct is based upon its interpretation of memory. So it's not the events necessarily that's happened into its life that creates it, but it's its interpretation of that. It's the meaning of that that's important. We see this very evident in the work of Viktor Frankl, in the work of logotherapy. And if those of you that are not familiar, Viktor was one of the unfortunate souls that were in the Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust, and going through that horrific experience, he noticed that some people would immediately give up and die, and other people would almost seem to become healthier and stronger with it. And he decided to go and interview these people, and when he started interviewing them, he started understanding there's a fundamental difference between these people. It was not their background or their history or their biology or anything like that. It was the meaning. It was the meaning, the interpretation people were putting on these events. Some people were putting on the event of like, oh, this is the end, we're all screwed, life is terrible. Not very unlike how a lot of people seem to look at things like the pandemics and the wars and things like that going on in the world today. Very similar, and they would give up, and as a result, their bodies would start to almost open itself to disease and weaken itself and everything else. And when he started to speak to the other people that had this different mindset, their attitude was very different. The meaning that they took from the event is that they have to overcome because they have to ensure this injustice never happens again. It was frames that had meaning that gave them empowering principles. This is really that old philosophy, or what I call the principles of the magician. There I said the first rule or the first principle of the Magi is to at all times, in all things, find a meaning that empowers us. And this is really what ritual magic or ceremonial magic boils down to. At its fundamental level, when we take out the sigils and all the complicated stuff, which are really like the building blocks or the alphabet, we fundamentally have a science to shift meaning. And this is important, you see, because when we shift meaning, we shift two fundamental things in our nature. We shift energy or emotion that we're experiencing or unlocking in ourselves. And as such, with a lot of emotional shifts, we basically shift consciousness. We shift the frequency, the things that we're picturing, the states that we're going into. And this shifts of consciousness is really what the old initiatory systems were about. You see, initiation in those systems were progressive stages of altering consciousness. And that's the first thing that we need to kind of put in perspective to begin recognizing this view. It is not that I am God. It is the recognition that at the quintessential essence of consciousness, of all consciousness, is that which has been termed God, or termed the Tao, or termed the higher self, or the universe, or whatever tradition you are in will use to represent, sigilize, in other words, this state of being. As such, there is a process, though, for actualizing it. We all have this inside of us at a potential level, the same way as you have within yourself the potential to be a great bodybuilder, but, choose to not. But at the same time, as much as all of us have the potential for cancer inside of us and don't necessarily manifest that either. It's all potentials are within every single one of us at the same time. The question is what process we engage in to reach through that expression. So when somebody's articulating these ideas, it doesn't by that simple definition mean that they've attained it. The map is not the territory, as NLP would so rightfully put it. This then brings us to one of the most fundamental concepts in the occult world, and that is that man as the macrocosm and the microcosm, or the Macroprosopus. This idealized entity or form, and we see it in varied forms. We see in the biblical context again Adam, that we start off with, and then Adam Kadman, or the perfected Adam. Now, when we recognize this, we understand that what's really happening in this thing is we see the projection of a man, and we see a map or a model of the archetypal universe projected onto the man. From the zodiac that is seen, to the planets that are seen, to the chakras that are seen, and to the more common Kabbalah or Kabbalistic tree of life that is seen. These are all different forms seen in different traditions, and if we study all of them, we can find correlation. That individual that's going, oh, my philosophy isn't Kabbalistic, or my philosophy is this and that. I mean, that's adorable, but that's very selfish and very limited in understanding, because if you truly understand the study of Kabbalah, not from a Judaic point of view, but from an esoteric and occult point of view, then we recognize that this is simply a memory tool or a correspondence system by which we can find the relationships to quickly identify, associate, and work in varied systems by seeing how that map works inside of ourselves. You see, this is very important. A good friend of mine, Mark Steinberg, head of the Creative Consciousness International, once gave a great metaphor. He said, new knowledge is like a splinter. You see, if you get a new splinter inside of your body, new knowledge, at some point, very soon, the body, considering this alien, will move it out. It will force it out. It will push that thing out because it's alien to it. And that is why so many people will take in ideas and they simply remain intellectual philosophy. When the fundamental essence is for this stuff to actually become part of us, we need to question our existing reality. A new bit of information needs to find resonance. In other words, it has to find a match of an existing known. We can only expand consciousness by expanding or altering or working with what is currently known to it. If we simply bring out new philosophies, then we have a bit of a problem. In the interpretation, although disputed, of the Abramelin in the French manuscripts by MacGregor Mathers, there's a very specific context where the magician says, if you were a Christian, be a Christian. If you were a Buddhist, be a Buddhist. Now, I'm paraphrasing lightly, but the idea was simple, that you shouldn't just eliminate or abandon your fundamental known model of reality, because that's going to create psychic dissonance within yourself, and that will add to more Klepothic drama instead of the resolution of the Klepothic drama inside of yourself. As such, we have to go into what our fundamental model of reality is and shift that by actively working with it. I had to work with the transmutation of my Christianity, not abandoning it, by researching where do these characters come from, who are they, what are their views, what actually happened at that time. So I had more knowledge to resolve this. In the book of Murdat, it says, with only through knowledge will you be free enough to embrace the truth. You see, now when we start exploring this fundamental idea of the macroprosopus, of the inside, outside, and you've heard it everywhere, as within, so about, as above, so below, the rich will be richer, the poor will be poorer. They all reflect the same essence. We see in Huda magic, we hear the idea of that the Hakahuna doesn't go out and see the tornado in the land and go, oh, there's a tornado. He goes and resolves the tornado within himself, and as such then dissolves the tornado in the land. This was the practice of the sorcerer, the one who works with and manipulates or alters source, the essential self. As I change, the universe changes outside of me. And this is the very thing that we understand self as a vast thing. So self is not me, the ego, me, the personality, me in the neocortex. It's the cerebellum that connects me to other brains. It is the world in which I live in. In Existential King, Caroline describes the unconscious in a very beautiful way, where she says it is the ocean of everything that is outside of you that you are not aware of. She adds to this idea, and you'll see the same idea echoed inside of varied other authors. For example, you'll see the episode where I interviewed Dr. Bruce Bynum, a brilliant clinical psychologist and behavioral scientist. He describes the journey, the development of this collective unconsciousness through the stages from ancient Egypt, where it was called the waters of Amenta, to its varied forms of manifestation, this process. This collective journey is seen through varied forms of psychology and process. Carl Jung referred to it as the collective unconscious. And we see the correlations in these maps between this aspect of the human psyche and the astral dimensions within ourselves, or the experiences out there. We recognize these subtle things as we begin this journey work within, that what is outside is within. In my work, you'll see a very detailed map of how I correspond to the Jungian archetypes and the Freudian archetypes of the king, warrior, magician, lover to the four elements, how we correspond the attachment wounds to the supernals. All these supposed great spiritual fundamentals still have a correspondence inside of us as individuals, and that is what gave birth to the recognition of the varied correspondence systems that are in existence today. Why does this planet or this sphere have attributions of these qualities? This is where the true magician or the true practitioner started to realize that it wasn't my devotion to this external entity. It was my devotion not to the external entity already present within myself. or this, and again, not my ego, not my personality, but in this greater experience of myself. Now, this is a very important idea to understand, and this is usually where the neophyte kind of freaks out a little bit and goes, oh, but it's greater because it must be greater than myself. And this is actually only because they perceive their sense of self as very limited. They see themselves as the sinner, as the person with limits and things like that. So it's difficult for them to attribute these qualities to themselves fairly. This is why the ritual processes exist the way they do. We evoke, then we invoke. We go through that process. But they are systemic desensitizations, the same way you need to socialize yourself through experience and not through assumption. You see, this brings us into the land of quantum mechanics, where we get to understand one of the most essential ideas, and that is that there is no such thing as outside inside. It just does not exist. If I break down this table and I break down to the atoms, to the nucleus, eventually I'm going to get to a space that is just pure information. If I then start exploring the effect of how that energy collapses into solid matter, how that wave becomes a particle, that wave, aka the mother, the feminine, the goddess, becomes the solid, the God, or vice versa, depending on your interpretation of these ideas. The initial yin-yang, the initial duality principle, the way that comes into articulation or into realization is very fundamentally important. You see, because it helps us to understand that through the act of observation of matter, I have an impact on it. Now, that doesn't mean I alone control the structure of the physical universe. Think of all consciousness spread across all bodies, being observers, collectively creating reality. This is the fundamental premise behind every religion and spiritual system, that the world itself is Maya. It is the illusion. It is the projection on the template of the holographic unconscious, where we begin to say certain things are real and not real, and it's through that making of real through perception that we perceive them or bring them into being. We see the same description in the biblical context, where the image, the world is null and void, right? It's in that state, and then the image is perceived, and then the word is spoken that brings it into being. In other words, it becomes vibrationally coherent to the one perceiving it, and that's what brings it into experience. You see, what this gives us the insight to is that, yes, at a conscious level, at this outer, almost Darwinian level of perception, we are separate. I'm physically separate from you. You're physically separate from me. I have my own agency. You have your own agency. We are not one at that level. However, at a quantum mechanical level, at a fundamental subatomic level of reality, we are. And that's what is meant by this idea of oneness, and we are one. Now, we can measure this. There are scientific experiments that can measure changes in the field that concentrate when we focus on a major event, a major political event or a major catastrophe, how the field moves from an incoherent frequency to a sudden coherent frequency as that mass energy of focus goes into it. But the catch is here is that every single one of us is made up of it. That means I am made up from it, you are made up from it, the spirits are made up from it, which means I am you, you are me, I am the spirits. And this concept known as authority or power is given through the act of this fundamental assumption of what the rules are of reality. You see, in essence, we as man and woman, we as human, simply limit this 11 or multi-dimensional God that is beyond our current perceptual models from this manifestation into 3 dimensions of time and space. Hence the fact that we create the process of time. We create the process of space so that we can have this tangible material experience of it. And as such, bring our Malkuf, raise our Malkuf, our kingdom, up through the varied stages as we ourselves evolve through those varied stages. But there is a direct relationship between the two. As such, this concept that so many occultists seem to have about God versus the devil, and I pick this side versus that side, is fundamentally flawed at a quantum mechanical level. it's essentially incomprehensible that if something is God, that it could have an opposite. This is also why, Kabbalistically speaking, the perception initially of the source is called the ayin, which translates not as nothing, but as no thing. In other words, that which is outside of this good versus evil, this right versus wrong, this sphere of manifest duality that we find ourselves in. You see, the problem is that many confuse the arguments many occultists actually have by thinking that they're arguing this fundamental God versus the beast. It's not. Even if you explore the black path, the dark path, as you move into the black sun, this is where God and the beast unite and become one thing. There's no contradiction in there. The contradictions, or the idea of this one versus the other, is purely at the level of politics. It's purely at this level of church versus state, of these areas. That's where it becomes a debate or a fight for freedoms and for rights and things like that. And that's what is being rebelled against. Hence why the symbolism even of the adversary of the devil is that of an adversary. It's more of a political opponent, than anything, pointing out these weaknesses in the system to break. That in of itself gives us an understanding of the nature also of God. When Moses approaches God in the burning bush and asks, hey, what do I say to these people who called me? He said, Ayer Asher Ayer, which many have translated as I am that I am, but accurately translates as I will be that which I will be, denoting that the concept of God and the concept of evolution is the exact same thing, and that all these fundamental principles that we see manifest throughout all religions and spiritual systems, these archetypes that are collectively built on top of each other, templated from the same collective unconscious mind we all share as a species, is actively working to express itself at varied levels of maturity. And as such, these are conflicts. As we resolve them within ourselves, we will resolve them in our societies. So I would have loved to just jump on and keep talking through all of these things, but I realize I can do that for days. And oftentimes, if we're sitting together inside of a training session or a process, this is something that would quite literally take days or constant workings to go through in a process. In fact, it's this very thing that led me to now recently launch my latest program, the Daemontorship. And I thought that name was quite clever. Daemon meets mentorship is literally what it is. It's a mentorship for where I work with you to get in touch with your own daemon, your own inner God, your own inner higher genius and sacred self through these internal processes. And I've broken that process down into 3 major stages, which represent very much the 3 alchemical stages, so they can be respectful of your budget and where you are in your current state. The first stage is the initiation. The second state is the magus. And the third state is the technomancer. And to give you a very basic summary, inside of these, I work in 3-month cycles actively with you in a sprint-like fashion. That means every week, you and I have an hour to 2-hour call where we go through coaching and therapy, and we work together through a certain area of problems. And then we have actual sprints and tasks for that next week. And I check in with you via the phone every second day to see where are we, what are we discovering, and we work actively together to get you through those stages so you can unlock those changes and that growth within yourself as you go through your own development, but not in isolation anymore, with somebody that knows the way to help you through that. And that's the first stage. That's the inner work. Then we move into the second tier when we go into Magus, where we go into how do these planetary ideas work in terms of practical aspects to developing that. How do we become enchanters? How do we become influencers in our society? Because the planets, where the elemental dimensions of initiation really is our inner life, our shadow work, our development of our fundamental personality vehicle that really sits at the heart of how we experience reality, to moving into the aspect of the Magus where we recognize that the planets literally represents all human desires. That's the space where we look at how do we achieve those desires in practical, measurable ways. What are our tactics? What is the action? This is more the doing stage. This is the technique stage. This is the ritual stage, the practical stage, the linguistic, conversational, influence stage, where I work with you to develop those skill sets inside of yourself and become a master influencer and persuader, as well as somebody that's able to set goals and realize them in an effective way. This has been a big thing for me in my life. It took a lot, and I realized even when I was mastering those things, I would still struggle to take action because I didn't have the base down. I didn't really have my elemental dimensions develop. I didn't understand what those supernals meant within myself, so hence why I do that first. And then when that's there, when you're able to do the inner work, you've done the inner work, you're in contact with your inner daemon, you're working from that place, you have the skill sets to express in the world, I help you build the commercial product that you're supposed to launch, your brand at a corporate level. With the work of my digital agency, we sit and work together to create that experience for you, where you get to work with industry professionals that have worked. I mean, I myself code in over 40 languages at this point. It seems ridiculous, but that's just because I'm counting all the silly ones as well. But also all the different technologies, from machine learning to robotics to virtual reality. And I work with you as well in the final tier to get to making your dream app or your dream brand a tangible digital reality to express and experience. So if you're interested in working with me, you can find the link to the Daemontorship Program. I will be cutting that off, however. You see, because of the level of intensity of this program, I can only take in a certain amount of people within a certain time period. But there is still some slots open, so please do check the link, send me a mail, and let's see if we can get you in that program if you're interested in working directly with me to get some of these inner processes or challenges overcome, so we can get you to the next level of your experience and your manifestation. Now, as I mentioned, I would love to have expressed all of this stuff, but we're already running into a lot of time, especially for the platform that we are in. Now, if you're inside of the Cult of You program, you can get a lot more of these details at a far more extended level, where I really go into far more specifics. But because of this YouTube format, I've chosen to break this lecture down into multiple videos that'll be releasing over the next coming months. So it'll help you kind of get a progressive line, also give you enough to digest and chew on, instead of becoming word hungry, as most of us do. We tend to become very excited on new knowledge and new ideas, and then we fail to actualize or personalize or bring that. One of my greatest spiritual teachers, the man that I mentioned earlier in this video, Papa Sirio, said to me, you know, the most important thing, Adam, is not that you're learning new information or that you get a PhD or any of these things. It is, do you make that information, that idea, that knowledge your own, and what do you do with it? That's what's more important. This is a man that couldn't read or write, but built hospitals, paved roads in towns that never had them. You know, he had such incredible power of manifestation, of actualization. And his principles and his philosophy were so simple. We've had a lot of really great ideas here. I hope you take value of it. And this lecture does continue. So please, this is part of a series that I'm releasing that adds on to the Master Mini class. So do check back every month so you can get the next episode, or depending on how I end up releasing these pieces. And if you find during this discussion that we've had that there's something that I said, or there's an idea that it's brought up, please share that with the group, quote unquote. You know, share it in the comments, give me your feedback, and ask questions of what you would like to discuss with me. Now, I may not always be able to get to this, but if you'd like to get a little bit more direct, you'll also find the main link, which is our main Linktree link to all of our links, where you will find the link to our Discord community. And even though that's not something that I spend a lot of time with, I'm always responsive to any questions that you ask there. So pop in, ask a question, and there, if you don't want to share it here in the public format, you can always DM me there directly, and I'm happy to answer it and maybe even bring some content out around that subject, because what is most important for me is that we are all practicing occultism responsibly. Trust me, from somebody that has walked this path for many, many years, you know, I don't want to even admit how many years I've been in this already. There's a lot of stages where this is seemingly purely psychological, but as you break past that, as you stop perceiving this concept of self as purely a psychological thing, and you recognize we're speaking of the fundamental transcendent self known as God, as the God body, or the Tao that we are all expressing parts from, you will recognize what Crowley meant when he said, there is no part of me that is not of the gods. It is essential that you recognize that as we make that progress in that realization forward. Till we speak again, I look forward to our next conversation. I'm Adam Nox, and remember to live deliciously.